Christianity actually also has the solution to that, which is to remember that God is love and we are made in the image of a loving God. And that is really important to remember because even if we can externalize our intelligence, we cannot externalize our love.
Hi, I'm Greg Kutsona from Science for the Church, and today I'm really excited to talk with Brian Patrick Green, who is Director of Technology Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. And among other things, he's a specialist in technology and AI and religion. And this is particularly the topic that I want to focus on today is the effect of AI on theology and on the study of religion, and particularly how it has an impact on Christian faith. So Brian and I got to know one another through the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley and their Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences. And so I've just found, Brian, I just found you such an interesting person in so many ways. And appropriately enough, I had AI come up with, your other things you've done, and I'll refer to that. But I was really interested by this. I think this is actually on the website. You're a lead contributor on 3 World Economic Forum case studies on ethical practices at Microsoft, Salesforce, and IBM. And you've worked on the Partnership on AI, the Vatican's Dicastery, is that how you pronounce it?
Yep.
For culture and education and technology and education. And basically, you've been involved in this world of technology, probably embedded in it in the Silicon Valley. So I told you before we started talking that I wasn't going to do a long intro. So there you have it, Brian. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you too. It's been a long time, and I think we first meet at that conference in Venice back in like 2010 or something like that.
I think we did. I mean, what Tom Ord had one of the great boondoggles of all, which was the Venice School on Science and Religion. I mean, it was a great conference too, but to put it into in Venice and to be there was just amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it was a good time. It was really enjoyable, and it was good to
Yeah.
meet you there. And yeah, I mean, there's just plenty to talk about. I mean, this field is exploding. It's moving really, really fast. It's going to have huge impact on society, including the church. And I actually think the church has a really um, big role to play in both directing the technology towards its better ends, and also in terms of picking up the pieces when society is going to be impacted by a lot of negativity that could potentially come from this.
That's a great opening statement. I love that. Because as you know, Science for the Church is about how the resources of science and technology can benefit the ministry of the church. And so I'm particularly interested in that side of things. Do you mind if I start though with how did you get into this topic of science, technology, and religion?
Yeah, well, it all goes back to when I was 2 years old. And in that way, it kind of does. It's right. So when I was a little tiny kid, my dad sat me in front of the television to watch Cosmos with Carl Sagan.
Hmm.
And after watching Cosmos for my entire life, growing up, until I got to college, I thought, "Ooh, I want to be a physicist because physicists are obviously super cool." Um, so I was really interested in science all through my education in high school and into college. And then I got into college and I realized, you know what, I really just don't like calculus. I don't like it at all. And so I said, forget about physics. I won't do physics. Okay, I'll find the next most sciencey thing I can find that's not so mathematical. So I went towards biology and specifically genetics. And I started doing, I majored in genetics at UC Davis. Um, Took, all the genetic classes, molecular biology classes, started doing laboratory work associated with that. And I discovered actually I really hated molecular biology laboratory work. It was it was slow and boring and very crude in terms of taking a pipette and moving liquids between little tubes and basically, and I did a summer internship at Genentech, sorry, just to make sure that I either was or was not going to proceed down this path. And that just confirmed me. It's like, it doesn't matter if it's in academia or an industry, molecular lab work was not for me. So then what happened is my wife and I got married after college. Within 6 months of college, we got married. And within 6 months of that, we joined the Jesuit Volunteers International and were in the Marshall Islands out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So the Marshall Islands, some people might remember, but a lot of people don't realize that the United States took over the Marshall Islands during World War II. We liberated them from Japan. They're very grateful that we liberated them from Japan because the Japanese were treating them horribly during the war. But then the United States turned around and said, "Hey, can we borrow some of your islands for nuclear weapons testing?" And the Marshallese said, "Oh yeah, sure, that's all right. You've been so helpful to us so far. Why don't you go ahead and do that?" And so we made 10% of their country uninhabitable to this day because of nuclear weapons testing.
Wow.
You can go to these places, but you can't eat the food there. You cannot eat the fish. You cannot eat the coconuts from the coconut trees. They're all still poisoned with fallout
Wow.
from the nuclear weapons testing. And so, based on that, I got really interested in the social impact of technology. I mean, I had students who had X's across their throats because they had had their thyroids removed because they were still getting poisoned by radioactive stuff. Um, and so, like I said, this got me really interested in the social impact of technology. I went to the GTU for a
Can I go
master's.
back to Marshall Islands just for a second, Brian? Is that
Yeah,
okay?
yeah,
Because I have a friend who taught there,
yeah,
and he told me that at some points the Marshall Islands is extremely narrow, and so the
yes.
impacts of climate change and the rising of the sea level really has a direct impact. Like it might almost just take over these narrow parts of the island, which are, less than 100 feet wide or something like that.
Yeah, I mean they're just sandbars basically. These islands are literally sand and gravel bars that are sitting on top of a reef. And if you think about how reefs form around islands, the Marshall Islands are those reefs, and the islands have sunk into the ocean. So the islands have
Wow.
completely eroded away, and only the reef is left. Um, and you're exactly right. Sea level rise is making them go underwater. When I was there between 2001 and 2003, I told my students, climate is changing, sea level is going to start rising, and you just need to be aware of that for your country. And what's happened in the last 15 years or so is they've had started having flooding events almost every year now. If there's a
Wow.
high tide with waves on top of that, it just starts washing over the islands, and the islands get flooded. And it's only a matter of time before they become uninhabitable. And when we think about it in terms of human power, like we're talking about the destruction of entire country, being wiped off the face of the earth. These people are going to have to find another place to live. And there are three other countries like this in the world. There's the Maldives, there's parts of Kiribati, and there's the island of Tuvalu, the nation of Tuvalu, which is also a set of coral atolls. And so we're dealing with powers here that are vastly beyond anything humans have ever had to deal with. They're much more, reminiscent of something like Poseidon would do back in the Greek, mythology in
Right.
terms of, flooding entire countries. We've got to really scale our ethics to go along with the kind of power that we're wielding now.
All right. Wow. It sounds like it.
Anyway, so thank you for the interruption.
Well, I just thought
I
that
do
was
have a
so interesting
tendency
when
to
I've heard
monologue
that.
sometimes, so if you want to interrupt, feel free.
I thought it was so interesting the first time I heard it, and so I don't know. I just want to ask you from your experience. But anyway, going on, you were
Yeah.
proceeding from that. Yeah.
So I got to the GTU and found Ted Peters and Bob Russell and all of our friends there at CTNS, and it was just, it was a great fit. Spent the next 9 years there getting my master's and my PhD. And then I moved towards Santa Clara University. Santa Clara University had opening for teaching ethics to engineers in the engineering school. So I started picking up classes there. I applied for 50 jobs in all the philosophy and theology departments that I thought would be interested in this sort of subject matter. Turns out that theology and philosophy departments are not, they didn't seem to understand, at least 15 years ago. They didn't understand that this was actually going to be an issue.
Mm,
So I ended up getting, yeah, once again, hired at the engineering school. I worked there and half-time at the Markkula Center. And then over time, my job at Santa Clara has just grown. And so I'm the director of technology ethics there now. And spending about 90% of my time on AI ethics and about 10% of my time on space ethics, which is a lot of fun too.
Because
Although,
you wrote a book on that, right? I mean, I
yeah,
have a
yeah,
little cheat sheet here. Your book on space ethics, it isn't that long ago, right? 2021. There we go. Good. I love it.
that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. I mean, so I would love to talk to you about that too. I know we won't have time for that, but that's amazing. I mean, just the different things that you've been a part of.
Yeah, space. I'm really attracted towards the forward edges of technology and what that is doing to humanity and what we need to be thinking out about in terms of what are we actually doing here? What are we trying to accomplish? Does this fit in with our role as human beings in the universe, or is this something which is ultimately, going to harm us rather than helping us? So these kind of deep questions are they're really important for us to be contemplating going forward. And like I
And
said,
sorry, go
the
ahead. Yeah, I
the
have a
church,
question for you in that light. Yeah.
yeah, the church just has a huge role to play in this.
I mean, I love that affirmation and the fact that you care so much about the church and you're part of it. That by itself is really important, again, for the organization of science for the church, but also for me personally. I'm really, so I want to zoom to something. It's a very it's kind of a specific question, but it's related in my mind to space and to AI. So let's see if where you
Hmm.
go with this in terms of answering. But I've been really fascinated by a question. Does AI invalidate the Christian doctrine of the incarnation? And the way that it could be posed is AI does such a good job, an increasingly good job of replicating human discourse. I mean, it's not perfect yet, but it's getting better and better, as my students
Hmm.
who submit essays know, right? Um, and because the Christian doctrine of the incarnation is about the word at some level, right? Not at some level. I mean, that's very specifically in the Gospel of John. The Logos became incarnate, pitched a tent among us, etc. There, you could make an argument that, well, AI is invalidating this central part of Christian doctrine. And this goes then to connect with space in my mind, as I've discussed it with a couple of different people, because there's that question, I think it's Guy Consolmagno talks about, would you baptize in AI, right? So one associated question is not does AI invalidate the resurrection, or excuse me, the incarnation, but does it incarnate intelligence into things and perhaps beings at some point? Would we want to baptize them? All that sort of thing. So, you know what I mean? So, I'm interested. This is just really a kind of a personal interest, but it's related to our conversation. What do you think about the effect of AI on, the doctrine of incarnation? And as I said, it relates to me with space ethics. We don't have to pull that, you don't have to pull that in, but how does that connect? And how much is AI embodying or even incarnating or maybe some similar concept of intelligence into the world?
Yeah, I think one of the things I would do is kind of reverse the question and say, what does the incarnation have to say about AI? And I'd
Mhm.
say the first thing is that we when we interact with a large language model, for example, ChatGPT, we feel like we're interacting with a kind of a disembodied intelligence, but that intelligence is embodied. It's running through computer chips in a data center, right? There's a massive data bank there. There's all the chips with electrons being shoved through them by large amounts of electricity being pushing electrons through these chips. So we should absolutely think of it as being embodied. But we also really need to consider, what is the nature of AI? AI is not intelligence in the way that humans are intelligence or in the way that God is intelligence. AI is kind of it's much more of a simulation of intelligence, I think is the way I would describe it. Um, in that it it has taken all of human knowledge that is available on the internet, which is not all of human knowledge. It's a limited set of text and images and things like that that are found on the internet, and then it squashes them together into a neural network where these little nodes on the neural network connect ideas or concepts. They're called tokens. Um, it connects them all with each other. Basically, they're words, if you want to think about it, and then draws vectors between them with how heavily those things are associated with each other. And it has many layers that it goes through, so it's not just a one-dimensional network; it's a multi-dimensional type of vector space, which is really a weird thing to think about mathematically, but and like I said, I don't really like math, so I'm not going to get into it more than that. But what comes out then is this statistical association of how ideas that it has accumulated from the internet associate with whatever prompt you give to it. So you put a prompt into it, and then it predicts the next word. It says, oh, if somebody asks something like this, then the response should be something like the blank, 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 filling in, X, Y, Z, A, B, C, until it gives you something which is remarkably coherent because it just has that much processing power behind it. Um, but what I would say is that some people criticize AI for making hallucinations. My response is that it's all hallucination. There's
Mm,
no intelligence behind it, actually, other than the statistical association that it's gathered from what humans have written in the first place. So it doesn't understand what it's doing. There's no mind inside of an AI. It's reflecting human minds, and it is statistically abstracting from a very large collection of human mental output, but it's not actually doing the thinking itself. And so I think if we recognize that difference between AI and humanity, that sets up some of the difference for why it's not really incarnated word in that way. One of the things I like about the word logos is that it's connected to the word logic also, right? Logic or
mhm,
ology, the study of, and those sorts of things. It has a scientific connotation to it. And I think when we think about Jesus, we should think not only about the word of God, but also the reason of God.
mm.
Um, and the rationale that's behind why everything exists the way it does. And when we conceptualize it kind of at that larger level, I think we can start to recognize that AI is really a tool. It's something that humans have created, and therefore it doesn't have kind of a life of its own. It exists as a part of the world that we've created, that humans have made, and we have to really ask ourselves, what is the purpose of AI in this world as we've created it?
Yeah, wow. That's a brilliant answer. Thank you. This is the kind of thing we wanted to get from you, Brian. Thank you for that. Can I lean on a couple of things that you said to just pull out
Mhm.
some of your thoughts? One is you mentioned the limited set of data that
Mhm.
AI has, and I was really struck in a podcast I heard with a game developer, like a CEO of a game development company in Korea, as I recall. And essentially, she said that, anybody who's not on broadband is not going to be in part of an AI data set. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of the world that is not represented. I think the number she had was about 1 billion people of the planet. It might be higher than that, and maybe but my point here is by necessity, this is going to create a bias in AI toward what, has been termed weird, right?
Yep.
Western, European, blah, 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 blah. And I
Yep.
wonder if you have any comment on that aspect of the limited nature of the data set with which, especially large language models, are working.
Yeah, yeah, and you're exactly right. Large language models are being trained on text from the internet, and very often companies like OpenAI say, "Oh, we've taken all of human knowledge and put it into our AI." And you can respond back to that saying, "You really have not." I mean, you've collected stuff from journalists, from scientific journals. You've, I mean, they've collected, people's blog posts. They've scraped the entire, web of everything that they can get. I mean, my bio has been, I'm sure, scraped and put into AI. Lots of things that I've written have been put into AI. The way I was introduced to ChatGPT was funny because a person I was on a Zoom call with said, "Hey, yeah, let's ask ChatGPT write an interview with Brian Greene on technology ethics," and it wrote something that was very clearly based on something I had written at some point. And I said, "Oh wow, this is weird, man,"
Yeah.
and that was my introduction.
I mean, I don't know, Brian, if you've ever had one, there was a Google Notebook LM. Is that the right sequence of that? Do a podcast of you? Because there's a podcast they've created of the first chapter of one of my books, and it's two people talking about my book.
Yeah,
And it's really, I mean, it's like basically it's an interview essentially
yeah.
without me being there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. I've heard of it. I haven't used it myself, although I keep meaning to get to it, but I haven't managed to. I've heard lots
Yeah.
of people who have really appreciated Notebook LLM.
I mean,
Um,
but that's a funny thing, like just talking about the interview thing. Like it can become you in a way, you know what I mean?
mhm,
Or it replicates something that is you. I don't know how to put it.
right,
Um,
right.
if you don't mind me interjecting one other thing, I know you use the common language of hallucinate
Hmm.
for AI, and your caveat qualification is really important. I've also been challenged, and I can't remember the article that this comes from, to even evacuate our language of agency with AI. Like
Hmm.
hallucination too quickly personalizes AI.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so that it's just mistakes. I mean, it's just
Yep.
a processing mistake. It's not we hallucinate or we do things that are human that are like that, but
Hmm.
AI is not really doing that. It's just making mistakes essentially. And
Yep.
we should depersonalize the language when we talk about AI. I wonder how you would respond to that assertion.
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, other people have said, you know what, it's not a hallucination, it's a fabrication.
Hmm.
Or I mean, there are less polite words with it, BS type things, right?
Right. Yeah.
And it's just telling you what you want to hear, basically. It's
Right.
come up with a relatively convincing way to respond to what you're saying. Um, and I mean, the machine learning professors at Santa Clara, one of them, her name is Maya Ackerman, actually, and she's been on a lot of podcasts herself because she's been working with machine learning and music generation for a long time. And what she said is, look, these generative AI formats have no relationship to the truth. Their relationship is towards producing creative new outputs. They're literally called generative AI. They generate new things. Not every new thing created is going to have is going to be true. Some of it's going to be false,
Hmm.
and it's better just to assume that it's all fiction, and then sometimes that fiction actually corresponds with our what we recognize to be reality. And when she said that I think makes a lot of sense to me in terms of the way these things are operating, and it means we need to not trust them so much for one thing, and also just recognize that they're trying to maximize engagement for one thing, to get you to use them as much as possible, unless you're starting to drive them out of business. Because I think I'm trying to remember. I think the newest models are so compute intensive that people will pay $200 a month to have access to these models, but $200 a month is still them losing money because it's so expensive to buy the electricity and amortize the cost of the chips and everything else associated with them keeping their lights on, that it's they're that it's a lot more expensive than a lot of us appreciate in terms of how energy intensive and cost intensive it is on their side.
Well, I first came into contact with this problem when I ran into Noreen Hertzfeld. I'm almost literally at the American Academy of Religion, not last year, but the year before. And and she says, people really aren't talking about the energy usage
Yep.
issues of AI. Well, and the water usage, which is related to that. Like this is an ecological, environmental problem as well. All of the use of energy is so hidden from us. And as I see AI now, it's a marketing thing. It's just added to stuff. Meaning phones and computers, just how can I say, not naturally, but it's done without you even agreeing to it. It kind of makes me cringe a little bit because I don't really need it, as an
Yep.
end user,
Hmm.
and just the amount of energy that it uses and water is disturbing to me. So. It's worth saying that because I think that's a hidden element of this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, Santa Clara, we had a conference on this back on November 1st, I believe, on the environmental impact of AI, and
Hmm.
those videos are all available online. I could drop a link in or send it
That'd
to
be
you.
great. I'd love to
Yeah.
put it in our newsletter, which this will appear in. We do have links, so that'd be great. We'll
Okay.
put that in there. Yeah,
Fantastic.
yeah.
All right,
So,
we've gotten a little off. I can't even remember what we were talking about before I
well,
started
I've
doing
got
this
a great
aside.
anchoring point here. So here's an anchoring question because I didn't start with this. How would you define AI?
Okay.
You've given some direction, and I actually, just for what it's worth, I like defining after you've done a little work and saying, well, here's what we've talked about. Now, here's what the definition is. I know it's not the way philosophers often proceed. So, having done that, this is the method I enjoy. So, how would you define AI?
Yeah, so I would define artificial intelligence as the attempt to take concepts that we generally associate with natural intelligence and automating them into a computer. So, for example, language production is kind of a prime example of this. Mathematical type of calculation, um, and producing art, those sorts of things, playing games, that kind of stuff. Um, but what I would also say is that it should include things like being able to walk, being able to use your hands, all this stuff that we don't actually think of as being very smart, right? This is stuff that babies can do, is learn to walk and use their hands. But because we don't conceptualize that as how incredibly difficult it actually is, we don't think of them as being intelligence. And so when people started working on artificial intelligence back in 1956 or 57 or something like that, back when they had this first Dartmouth conference, the Dartmouth conference people said, "Oh, we'll have this cracked in a few years, and we'll have all the robots from science fiction and everything." And what they discovered is that actually it's been about what 70 years since then, and we're still we're at a very fast inflection point right now. We're going up the slope really fast, but we haven't gotten robots that can really do a whole bunch of stuff yet. The robots are improving quite quickly, but for a long time, people just didn't appreciate how very difficult it is to walk.
Mm, yeah. Well, and I think from what I've heard from people who have to walk again, like they've lost it
Yes.
for some reason, you recognize that. You could,
Yep.
because it happened for most of us very early in life before we were cognizant, and self-reflective. Wow, that's really fascinating. And obviously that definition is incredibly helpful. So another general question then is, if you were to create a sketch or a typology of the ways the theological approaches to AI, what would they be?
Yeah, I think I come at it from the human perspective. So with my work with the Vatican's Dicastery on Culture and Education, um, we published a book back in late 2023. Excuse me, I have to sneeze. Excuse
Bless
me.
you. It is definitely allergy season. I can feel it up here in Chico for sure.
Yeah, it's starting. I'm gonna have to start taking medicine.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think that might be one of the first big sneezes of the season. Anyway, you can cut that out of the
We,
podcast.
you heard it here, right?
Yeah. So, so the first book that we wrote with the Vatican's Dicastery for Culture and Education was on the anthropological aspect of AI. What does AI mean in terms of, is it like a human being in terms of consciousness, in terms of relationality, in terms of how it will operate in society, in terms of its theological, perhaps, relationship with God? How does it operate in religion? Those sorts of questions. And I think from the anthropological side, one of the big questions is, if we identify human nature with intelligence, and then we take intelligence out of ourselves and stick it in something else, and we make that external object smarter than we are, quote unquote smarter, then what does that mean for us? Have we just made ourselves obsolete? And I think that deep question there is something that people are going to be wrestling with for the next couple decades at least, and saying to ourselves, well, this is we made ourselves obsolete. We don't have jobs anymore. People are getting laid off. There's going to be a crisis in meaning in terms of what is my role in society? Am I worthless? Do I no longer have if I no longer have economic value, does that mean that I no longer have moral, ethical, theological value? These sorts of questions are going to become huge. But I think that Christianity actually also has the solution to that, which is to remember that God is love and we are made in the image of a loving God. And that is really important to remember, because even if we can externalize our intelligence, we cannot externalize our love. Our love is intrinsic to us. Care, compassion, kindness, any way you want to conceptualize all the things that are around that term are something that is individual and particular to us as human beings in our relationships with other human beings. And so we really need to double down on this second, perhaps aspect of humanity that we've forgotten about, right? We tend to think very
Mhm.
Greek in terms of who we are. We need to be thinking more biblically in terms of who we are.
And so as far as we taking AI and the approaches, it's taking a human approach that emphasizes something beyond rationality and toward love. Am I hearing you correctly?
Exactly. We need to remember that Jesus, for example, is the Word of God, the Logos. If you want to think about Jesus as being the rationality or kind of that more logical or intelligent side, I don't necessarily think that's it's not really an accurate representation of what Jesus is because Jesus is so much bigger than we can possibly conceptualize. But if we think of AI as perhaps taking some of that away from us, if that is our self-conception, and like I said, I think that's a incomplete, it's an only partial conception, then we really need to remember, okay, maybe the reason, the love, the logic of God is the love of God. That's because God is unitary, right? God is Trinity, but also unitary. And the logic of God is the same as the love of God. They're the same thing. And even if AI looks like it's taking one of those away from us, it's not because they're bound together in who we are.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind when you say that is love and empathy, particularly as such a part of human beings, and of course in the ministry of Jesus. I was struck by something I heard the other day that I think it was Margaret Mead who said the first true Homo sapien, or the first true human, I think is the way she put it, human community was when she saw a femur that had been healed. Maybe you know
Right.
the story, right? Like, in
Yep.
other words, the community needed to take, I think it's about 6 weeks to heal a femur, to care for that member of their community for 6 weeks.
Yep.
That's when human society and humanity really started, in her impression as an anthropologist. And I mean, that in itself is fascinating. I think as a Christian theologian, I would say that's, you know, empathy is such a central part to us. Empathy, of course, and love are deeply connected. So that seems to be another element of what it means to be human and how God has created us. And then being a person influenced by Karl Barth, he would say, through his doctrine of reconciliation, we define humanity by how we see it embodied in the God man Jesus, and
Hmm.
Jesus is centrally about empathy and love.
Yep.
So all those things, I guess, relate to one another and connect with one another for me. So the human, the anthropological side and the theological side are very much connected. Would you,
Yeah.
I guess, maybe that's a statement of, does that seem reasonable to you in terms of how we approach that and then how that connects with AI particularly?
Absolutely. Yeah. We need to remember that we are more than just our economic and economic value, and insofar as our economic value is connected to intelligence, we're so much more than that too. There's deep important theological truths about humanity that rely on these ideas from our religion, from Christianity ultimately. And we really need to remember that is the case, because if we forget it, then we're setting ourselves up for a really kind of disastrous scenario, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think it reminds me that there are particular resources that the church has, related to the emergence of AI. And um, I could go two directions. Let me go the direction away from Christianity just for a minute. Is there anything you see in the way that AI interacts with, other religions and and additionally other forms of spirituality?
Yeah, so one thing I would say is that AI is being developed primarily in the United States and China. And so in China, China is very interesting because as Westerners, we look at China and we say, okay, China has three religions. It has Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. But in China, in communist China, because they're communist and they're not allowed to be religious, they call those three religions philosophies. They're traditional Chinese philosophy. So they recategorize them so that they don't have to throw them out because they're Marxist. And
Right.
then what they've done is, I mean, they're absolutely looking at their own traditions and saying, how does AI relate to Confucianism? How does it affect the five primary relationships, or those sorts of things, or our conception of how humans should interact in society? How does it interact with Taoism? Taoism is very much about the flow of energy through the universe and those sorts of ideas. How does it interact with Buddhism in terms of avoidance of suffering, or recognizing that the world's an illusion, or those sorts of things. I mean, it's a very different religious conceptualizations. That work is being done. We don't necessarily hear about it a lot in the West because it's not necessarily being published in English or in places that we can read about it. But the work is being done, and there are English resources on that. I'm not super familiar with them. All I can say is that I know that it's out there. And one of the things we're trying to do once again with the Vatican is to make sure that our perspective is being presented, the perspective of Catholicism, yes, but also hopefully broader for Christianity, because there is so much overlap, of course, between the Catholic Church and Orthodox and Protestant Christians. And if Christians, hopefully, in a broader sense, see the resources that we're producing in our work, they'll say, "Oh, we can do that too," or "Actually, I don't agree with that. I think we could come at it from a better perspective." So our work is very much meant to open the conversation, to get everybody thinking about these things, not to close the conversation. Um, One further thing I would say about that is that um, we've I guess we're trying to be provocative, if you want to think about it that way, right? We publish a book, and hopefully other religions say, "Hey, wait a minute, the Catholics they did something. We have to compete with them."
Right.
So,
That's good.
so by all
It-
means, compete with us, and hopefully together, we'll come up to whatever the ultimate right answer is. And I think, once again, I think the right answer is simple. It's just to remember that God is love and that humans are made in the image of God.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, there's just a profundity to that simplicity, right? I was so is this the book that you co-authored, Ethics in the Age of Disruptive Technologies? Is that the one you're referring to?
So not that book. This
Yeah.
this book is called Encountering AI. So
Okay.
the book you talked about, Ethics in the Age of Disruptive Technologies, we published in June of 2023. That's directed towards corporations. So,
Okay. Okay.
as you mentioned at the start, I worked a lot with corporations.
Yeah.
And the idea behind that book is to take some of the things that we learned from working with the big companies who are kind of out there in the lead, and then backing up and saying, what can we abstract from this? What can we share in terms of knowledge for other people to learn from? That's the purpose of that book. It's a handbook meant for corporations to incorporate ethical thinking into their companies. Um, the book that I've been talking about is called Encountering AI: Ethical and Anthropological Investigations, or as I like to shorten it to EAI, Encountering AI. And what's nice about that is that it's EAI colon EAI, Ethical and Anthropological Investigations. So it's really simple, three letters repeated. Um, and once again, the idea behind that book is to look at, what does AI mean for consciousness? What does AI mean for relationships? What does it mean for our relationship with God? Those sorts of questions. That's one half of the book. And the second half is looking at the ethical impact in terms of what is AI going to do to education? What's it going to do to family life? What's it going to do to healthcare? What's it going to do to all of these various fields of human endeavor that are now going to face the question of, should we automate this? That's ultimately what it comes down to, right? Should we automate healthcare? Should we automate education? Should we automate warfare? Should we automate the economy? Should we automate family life? I mean, you can think about Brave New World, right? That was an automated conceptualization of family life where everybody gets decanted instead of born, and then they're raised in these like baby factories. And that's going to become a possibility with the technology that we have laid out in front of us. And we have to ask ourselves, do we actually want this? And if we don't want it, what are we going to do instead to make sure that we're getting the positive future and not this nightmare dystopia that we could be on track for if we're not careful?
Right, right. Yeah, right. Wow. I mean, that's the thing that I think energizes a lot of people. For example, I teach a class at Chico State called The End of the World, and we look at three different scenarios for the end of the world, one of which is the transhumanist AI scenario. And, there's just so much in there to teach about, right? I mean, it's really easy to find honestly fairly good stuff that's been popularly produced.
Mm.
Um, and so my point being, it tends to skew though negatively, like that AI gets out of control. One of my favorite movies is Ex Machina,
Yeah.
which imagines, this robot Eva, and and her what would it be like, and did she pass the Turing test and all that sort of stuff. And without being a plot spoiler, it ends badly.
Yes.
She does not deal well with the human beings that have created her. And I think that's a sign of so many ways that we think about AI is the negative and the disruptive, more than disruptive, the destructive side of it.
Yeah.
So I
One thing I
appreciate,
would say,
yeah,
oh,
please
just
do.
to build on that, I would
Yeah.
say, if you think about the first principle of practical reason, the first principle of practical reason is something I did not learn until I was in graduate school, which is kind of silly. You'd think with something like that, the first principle, it should be something you learn in grade school or earlier. First principle of practical reason is do good, avoid evil. And with all these dystopian literature and movies and things like that, that's really important for figuring out what the evil is that we want to avoid. But
Hmm.
just avoiding evil doesn't tell you what you need to be actually doing. What is the good that you're aiming for? Um,
Yeah.
and AI is such a powerful technology that neutral is not good enough. Obviously, we want to avoid evil, but neutral is not good enough. It has to be directed towards something positive, or it's not going to turn out well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe that takes us to the place of where the church fits in this. And, since Science for the Church is really about how we can learn from science and technology, but also, we haven't really pursued this as much, but also how we need to engage with science and technology as the church, by which I mean the people who are called and respond to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So, as you pointed out, it has a wide expanse, and the Catholic, the Orthodox, the Protestant embodiment of that. So, how can the church engage with AI in ways that are positive, learning from it, using it, but also maybe in some ways resisting it?
Yeah, I think one thing to do is to recognize that there are a lot of Christians in the tech industry right now. Excuse me. There are a lot of Christians in the tech industry right now who are some of them are feeling isolated, some of them are feeling overwhelmed by the kind of forces around them that they're participating in. So definitely finding those folks and giving them support is a big deal, and there are organizations that help with that, which is good.
Do you have
Um,
any offhand that you would highlight?
so AI and Faith, there's an
Yeah.
organization called AI and Faith. It's not a purely Christian organization. There's also, I mean, there are various employee resource groups at various companies, like Google has a group of Christians who work in AI, and IBM has a group of Christians who work in AI. There are lots of kind of groups at companies who can identify with their Christianity together. That's really important because I think it gives them kind of an ethical a certain amount of ethical strength can be built on that community, right? If you feel like you're alone, then it's a very disempowering feeling. If you feel like there's at least one other person who agrees with you that ethics is important in AI, then that will start to empower you maybe to do a little bit more. And of course, if there are like 20 or 100 of you, then you can actually make an impact, hopefully, in the way the technology is developed in the first place. So that's kind of one aspect of it, for example.
Right.
Another thing would be to figure out how to use the technology in your own church. Is this something, maybe you can bring in an outside speaker to talk about, what is the right use of large language models, or what are some other places where AI is popping up where there are a lot of ethical issues? It shows up a lot in, for example, the game industry now. There are games that are designed to be addictive. They adapt how they give rewards to you based not on how well you're playing, but rather on what they know, how much frustration they can give you before you'll quit. So they let you win just enough so that you keep playing, so that they can keep showing you advertising. And it's not just games, right? It's social media. It's all these sorts of online things that try to take your attention. And we should really remember that all these things trying to draw our attention are taking our attention away from something else. And very often, what's being taken away from is family time, work time. Some also that's not something that we should have our attention drawn away from. But family time, obviously, God and religion and all these other sorts of things that we could be spending time on are really important. Um,
Can I just lean into that for a second too,
mhm.
Brian? I mean, it seems to me in reading the spiritual traditions, the spiritual writings in Christianity, that time in silence and time in the lack of distraction is like a common consensual theme of what it
Yeah,
means to grow in your relationship with God. So, the fact that we're there's a great line. This is from like 20 years ago. Continual partial inattention was what a Microsoft executive
Mm,
said about the internet. So before, AI was souping it up. And so I think that's really it's kind of simple, but I think it's pretty profound, the effect of always being distracted, and
yeah.
how these models are designed to keep our eyeballs or attention on them. I'll say one other thing since I'm talking. No, but I'll say one other thing that's related that feels like it's been around what we've talked about, which is just the power of market capitalism and all this, and the sheer amount of money right now being pumped into AI is you could probably say unprecedented, just because, of course, inflation means that this is probably more than ever before. But even if not, it's just so much money that there's going to have to be a profit motive behind it. That's just the
Yep.
way that this works, and that means it's going to take our time and ultimately our pocketbooks. With that is, AI is going to take our time and therefore our pocketbooks.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The economic motive behind it is it's in the tens of billions of dollars, headed towards hundreds of billions of dollars, headed towards trillions of dollars, right? There's a lot of money that people are putting into AI. They're not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts. They're doing it because they think that they are going to be able to replace people in a
Yep.
lot of ways.
Yep.
And if you can lay off a worker because you've replaced them with AI, then you're saving money. That's the kind of goal that they're thinking about. So one of the other things I would say about the role of the church is that when people start getting laid off, they're going to need somewhere to go. They're going to need someone to talk to, and so many of us we identify with our jobs, right? We say I am a professor, or I am a pastor, or I am, somebody, whatever your job is. I am that job. When you're asked as a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? It should be, what job do you want to have when you grow up, not what do you want to be when you grow up. The only right answer to what do you want to be in your grow up is I want to be a good person, right? I want to be I want to be
Right.
someone who ultimately, does good things in life, and hopefully also ends up in heaven and the afterlife is over. Um, but our conceptualization of being with an economic role is actually going to be really bad, as so much economic disruption happens from AI. So we're going to need to back off of that idea and say, okay, what am I? What am I actually in terms of my being? I consist of, all the identifiers that associate with me, but also my relationships, my role in the community, my parents, my children, my spouse, my brothers and sisters, all those necessary connections that are family and friends. We're so much more than just our economic role, and so we need to consider how to emphasize that. And once again, that requires doubling down on what makes us human in terms of love and our humanity and compassion and empathy, as you were mentioning earlier, and really finding meaning and purpose in life that's not necessarily economic in nature. I'm not a person who thinks that there are not going to be jobs in the future. There will absolutely be jobs. One of the safest jobs is pastor. So I think you got an important role, and your listeners have important roles in society. Also, it's not very likely you're going to be automated. Although every once in a while, there's like, oh, robot pastor at church,
Right, exactly. Yeah.
these headlines appear, right? They're invariably looked at as a novelty, and then a few months later they disappear, right? It's like, okay, on to the next thing. But I think
Yeah.
we
Go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, one last note on that. Um, this kind of disruption of meaning and purpose is going to be a big deal, and we just need to be ready to respond to it with, I think, the Christian message ultimately, which is that God loves you. God is love. You are made in the image of God. All these kind of very, very basic fundamental truths that are ultimately, they have salvific power, not just salvific in terms of, oh, you'll get to heaven someday, but ultimately also in terms of how things operate here on earth. Because if you have tens of millions of people roaming around the country feeling like there's no meaning, that's a recipe for disaster. That's not something anybody wants to have happen.
Well, I keep thinking of this phrase. A friend of mine joke about what an economic look at human nature is, and this idea of your net worth. Is
Yep.
the amount of money that you're worth, or what's in your portfolio or whatever. And that's such a distasteful way of describing the kind of people you just mentioned, people who are loved by God, who are made in
Yep.
the image of God. Um, so I just join with that and say amen. I think we're pretty much at time. Anything else you want to add, Brian, to our conversation?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, I think you're doing fantastic work, getting all these messages about science and technology out to the churches is just really, really important to do that. The church has a big role here. I mean, that I think that's the final message, right? We need to start recognizing that we're not just caretaker organizations, right? We're here to save people who are going to be in big psychological trouble potentially, and spiritual trouble associated with that. There's going to be a lot of disruption coming down the line, and we just need to mentally prepare ourselves for that and recognize that God loves everyone. I mean, that's the big picture here, and we've got our work cut out for us. It's not going to be easy, but if we do our job, I think that ultimately we can have a better future that includes AI. AI used in particular ways that are suitable for it, not in ways that replace people, but in ways that help people to accomplish things. And lastly, I would say there's just so much more to talk about. And I'm really glad that you're doing this work. And it's been so great talking to you. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Brian. I really appreciate all that you said and all that I've learned. So thanks.
Thank you.